Welcome to The Birth of a Genre, a brief history on the beginnings of detective literature. And I do want to emphasize the word brief there. This is a brief history. There is a lot we could cover. But just to give us an overview as we are diving into reading detective literature ourselves. So where do we begin? Well, let's begin with what people consider the first detective story. Now, there is some debate about this, but largely, kind of across the board, most people, most critics and historians say that the first detective story was The Murders in the Rue Morgue by Edgar Allan Poe. It was published in 1841. Now, in this story, we meet the detective C. Auguste Dupin. He's an amateur detective, one who enjoys the reasoning aspects of detection. He's interested in the logic of it. He's interested in being able to break down the clues, right? More than he is trying to win financial or professional power or, stardom, accolades. He's more interested in the actual reasoning part of the story. In this case, there are two women that are murdered, and he is going to use reason. He's going to examine the clues, careful consideration of written and spoken words in particular, to solve this murder. Now, it was the first detective story, but it was also the first of a certain type of detective story, what's called a locked room mystery. Now, locked room mysteries are pretty much exactly what they sound like. You've undoubtedly seen some movie or TV show that used, or read a book that used a locked room mystery. And what that is when, it's when a crime is committed in either a literal locked room or other enclosed space, and the locked room is locked from the inside, or it's enclosed in another way to make the crime seem at first impossible. It seems like there's no way that what we're looking at happened. And that type of story has continued even now. So The Murders in the Rue Morgue was the first detective story, but also the first locked room mystery. Now, Edgar Allan Poe wrote a few more Dupin stories. In all of them, he was solving cases, and from them and their popularity, we got some basic traits that established kind of the stereotype or the idea, the basic framework of a literary detective. First, there would be an eccentric detective. The story would follow that eccentric detective. He's the character, the methods of that person, that maybe they don't look like what everybody else does. And the primary focus of the story is to follow that eccentric detective and to see how he solves the crime. That, before crime had played a part in literature, but here the eccentric detective solving the crime is the most important part. That is what we are following. We also have a first-person narrator. That's someone who uses I, me, my, someone who's talking to you, a narrator. But the narrator isn't the detective. The narrator is a close friend or sidekick of the detective. And the narrator's also, this sidekick is going to have average intelligence. It acts as a contrast to the detective's extraordinary mental ability, and allows us to kind of get things explained to us because the narrator doesn't fully understand. So the detective has to explain it to him. And that allows us to know a little bit of what's going on in that brilliant mind. It's also one that uses logical analysis as the method of detection. Tales of ratiocination, I think is how you pronounce it, ratiocination. That's the term that Edgar Allan Poe used. In essentially that you're using rational means to solve the crime. We then also, in this case at least, had an innocent man arrested and then cleared by the detective. So this is the first time we have a detective who figures stuff out that is different from what the police know, right? The police think they've solved it. At the beginning of the story, they've already arrested someone, and the detective comes and kind of battles that authority. They're the ones over to the side that are smarter than the police, and therefore they can figure out what really happened and get that innocent man cleared. And this is also pulling on our ideas of justice, right versus wrong, right? Where he needs to solve the crime because we need to get the innocent person off, right? We don't want this innocent person to be punished. That was fundamental to this story. And this story established what the crime author Dorothy Sayers calls a solution by unexpected means, which essentially is a fancy way of saying the answer or the solution to the crime isn't what it first seemed to be on the surface. So the innocent man, it looked clear that it was him, but that's not the solution. And that's very much true with the murders in the Rue Morgue. You know, in this story, Dupin was investigating the murders of two women in a locked room. And through his, I'm going to spoil it for you now, but through his investigation, he discovers that the culprit for the two women's deaths is an orangutan. That's right, an orangutan. So kind of certainly an unexpected means of death, but also kind of undermining the idea that these are even murders, right? You can't commit a murder if you're not a human that understands, right or wrong and follows law. But either way, that is just one example. These are solved in an unexpected way, but in a way that makes logical sense based on what the detective has been able to break down the clues, how they see the clues. Now, it's possible that this list of traits reminds you of someone. The world's most famous detective, Sherlock Holmes. And if you notice that connection, I don't know if you've watched the shows on BBC, they're really great, or read any of the books, or seen any of the, countless adaptations of Sherlock Holmes. If that reminds you at all of Dupin and the murders in the Rue Morgue, you're right. There's a reason for that. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle started publishing stories about Sherlock Holmes in 1887. So more than 40 years after Edgar Allan Poe wrote this. The first Sherlock Holmes story was A Study in Scarlet. And we could talk all day about Sherlock Holmes, but what we can see here is that there was a connection here. Edgar Allan Poe started this genre by developing some kind of fundamental ideas as to what the detective would look like. And then Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, further down the road, a few decades later, refined those and created a detective that, had way more stories written about him and became way more famous and way more read, but built off of this foundation that Edgar Allan Poe began with the murders in the Rue Morgue. So the question becomes then, why did it start when it started? Why was the first story that we see as detective fiction published in 1841? I mean, crime has existed. People have broken the law since there was a law. As long as there's been a law, there's been people breaking it. People have murdered each other and stolen from each other throughout all of human history. And indeed, crime has been a big topic of literature. But there are a few reasons, kind of a bunch of different factors over the course of the couple hundred years up to Poe's Rue Morgue that helped to shape and inspire the detective story as we know it. And that's what we're going to get at here. Keep in mind, as I said before, this is an extremely brief overview, at times maybe even overly simplistic. I'm trying to focus on the points that are most relevant to our understanding of detective fiction. Your history professor would be horrified. But for our needs right now, let me just hit some high notes in the years, centuries surrounding when we got our first detective story. Means we're going to start with the Enlightenment. Roughly 1630 to 1789. The Enlightenment is also known as the Age of Reason. It's particularly influenced by writers and thinkers in France and England, such as these that you see pictures of here, Sir Isaac Newton on the top, John Locke, Voltaire on the bottom left, John Locke on the right. These are people one of the values of this time period is that we were going to question authority. So we're not just going to do what the people in charge tell us to do, because we're going to think about it. We're going to consider it. We're going to use logic to reach conclusions. And they did. They valued reason, the human ability to consider evidence and use reason or logic to reach conclusions. That is a big part of the Enlightenment. And because they believed reason to be universally accessible to humans, they valued a fundamental human equality. Now, of course, whenever we talk about fundamental human equality, we're talking about history, there should be a little asterisk next to it, because certainly many people have defined human equality in extremely narrow ways that have left out big portions of people. But what we want to see here is it was a general stance, an intellectual stance, even if not always in practice, that they valued intellectually the human equality, that humans could use reason, that anybody could do it, that they could reach their own conclusions. They didn't need authority to tell them what to do. You'll note, the late 1700s, when the Enlightenment kind of culminated, that's the same time as the American Revolution and the French Revolution, both of which were times that focused a lot on the Republic, giving power to the people. That grew very much out of the Enlightenment time period. Now, in the 18th century, popular literature focused a lot on crime and even gave us kind of the outlaw criminal, right? The criminal hero, that maybe your hero in these pieces in the literature at the time didn't follow all the rules. And maybe they even broke a lot of rules. And maybe they were wanted. Maybe they were chased. Maybe they were the bad guy. But they were popular in literature. Interestingly enough, it's also a time of increased reading and writing by women. And that's something that kind of continues to be true with each of these time periods as we move forward. But what's interesting there, when you get all of this, these factors together, what you can see as far as relates to detective fiction, to that kind of Rue Morgue story, the reasoning, the focus on logic, that was very big, fundamental part of detective novels. The idea that someone could examine the clues and reach the conclusion. Also, the questioning of authority, that tells us that people were valuing asking questions and seeking answers. Those were large cultural values that helped contribute to what would become the detective story. And more readers, even women, having an interest in crime. That starts kind of laying the groundwork for the 100 years later, not quite 100 years later, when we get our first detective story. Now, this interest blossomed, this interest in criminals and looking at kind of the dark sides of things, that blossomed in the age we transition to next, Romanticism.